let me welcome you again, and thank you again for coming. This is one of my favorite spots on the long and winding road that takes a writer around America. There aren't enough stores like this left, and this is one of the best of them all. And I thought that tonight, for that reason, because I don't feel I need to sell you in any sense, that I've discovered that as I've gone around that this book, though I hope it reads well, I hope that when you get it home, you'll find that you can read it in 2 or 3 nights. It doesn't read particularly well. That is, if I stand up here reading you bits of it, I don't think it works particularly well. Because though its primary purpose is to be an account, as vivid as I could make it, of 2 remarkable lives, it's also a book with an argument. It's a book with a thesis, a book that has a structure and a certain development. So what I'd like to do tonight is sort of synopsize the book for you, talk about its themes, its points, its purposes, and then let you lead me into a discussion of where you'd like to go. The book begins by thinking about this cosmic coincidence that Charles Darwin and Abraham Lincoln were born on the same day, February 12th, 1809. And I begin by pointing out that this is nothing more, in a sense, than a coincidence. It's an oddity, a singularity of history. But that coincidence is, in a sense, the vernacular, the slang of history. It's the first place where we begin to see patterns and that help us search for larger, more significant patterns of meaning. And think about how Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died on the same day, and that they both died on July the 4th. Well, that's no more than a coincidence. And yet, when you think about it, what that says about the will of both men to live to that July the 4th and what it said about the rituals and holidays of the new nation, it is, again, a piece of historical vernacular, a small, significant pattern. And this cosmic coincidence was, for me, an opportunity to reflect not so much on what these 2 men have in common. This book is not a series of occult parallels. You recall those cards that used to show that, Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy, and Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln, and so on. This is not that in any sense. This is not a book of occult parallels and resemblances between 2 very different lives. It's an opportunity for us to look back on these lives and think about the legacy that they've left us. It's not what they have in common with each other, it's what they have in common with us that matters. And so I ask you, at the beginning of the book, to think about what the world was like on that February day in 1809 when these 2 boys were born, one in a backwoods cabin in Kentucky, one in circumstances of considerable comfort in England, in the countryside of England. And we think about what the world was like then. We can think about what the conventional wisdom, the common understanding, the significant agreement was like in that time. First of all, people thought, and it's hard for us to wrap our minds around this thought because it's so alien to the way we think now, that democracy, liberal democracy, was not only fragile, but probably doomed. That was the general consensus, and you only had to think about the experience of the French Revolution, which was still in the process of being transformed in 1809 into Napoleon's imperial rule, to see why people would think that. As Lincoln would say later on, the basic belief was that democracy, however good it might sound as a principle, always degenerated into either anarchy or tyranny. It always degenerated either into the Reign of Terror or into Napoleon's rule, and that was the rule of democratic life, and it would always be like that. Even de Tocqueville, a very sympathetic observer and understander of the new experiment in democracy in the United States in the 1820s, said that for all that he admired in the country, he thought that the forces that were pulling the country apart, pulling the United States apart, would eventually prevail over the forces that kept it together, that was the cancer, in a sense, coded into the democratic experiment, and particularly, in Tocqueville saw in America, the force of slavery as a destructive pull that was already beginning to rend the fabric of liberal democracy in America. And if you think about, at the same time, not just about where democracy stood, how it was understood to be fragile and flawed, you think about the way people understood the larger world in which human beings acted, in which we occupy. And two things were true about the planet as it was generally understood. It was thought to have a very short history of a few thousand years at most. And the things that lived on it, the plants and animals, were each thought to have been created by some means separately, and that they had always been there and had always existed, and there were no transitions between them. The story of life was a room like this one, with independent volume upon independent volume upon independent volume, and the job of a scientist or a naturalist was to read and label each volume and put it in its right place on the shelf of nature. Now, there were people who disputed that. There were already whispers and whirrings of evolutionary ideas in the air. Charles Darwin's own grandfather, Erasmus, had written a long poem with evolutionary ideas about how little tiny swimmy things would become big, complicated, thinky things later on. But it was, in every sense, a poem, and only a poem, and belonged to the world of fancy and not fact. Those were the presuppositions that most people like us, most people who fill this room, educated, thoughtful, curious people had in 1809. Now think for a moment about how different the world was when these two men, when Abraham Lincoln and Charles Darwin died. Lincoln, of course, at the hands of an assassin in 1865, Darwin after a long illness in 1881. By that point, the idea that democracy could not only survive, could not only prevail, but that it could fight had become a part of the common knowledge of ordinary people. And it had become part of the common knowledge of ordinary people specifically through the example of Abraham Lincoln and the North in the Civil War. That is, not only did democracy and the idea of Republican government seem to be on the upswing, but it was clear that democracies could arm themselves and fight, that they could not only invent themselves, but that they could sustain themselves. And if you think of the larger cosmological or biological question, almost everyone agreed by the time Charles Darwin died that the history of life had been immensely long, that this planet had a time span that was almost unimaginably ancient. And at the same time, though the idea, Darwin's idea of evolution by natural selection was still controversial and would remain controversial well up into the 1930s and 40s until genetics and evolutionary theory married in what's called the neo-Darwinian synthesis. Although evolution by natural selection was still debated, the basic idea that the forms of life had a single story, that to understand the history of life on this planet was not to shelve many books, but to read one book. To read one book in which each page revealed a new story of common ancestry and shapely descent. That was an idea that almost every educated person by then accepted, as indeed we do now. Because the other thing that strikes me is when I describe that not only had the world changed, but the fundaments and foundations of our world were in place. Because we still accept and believe, sometimes unthinkingly, sometimes uncritically, that liberal democracies can not only prevail, but that they can be fighting forces. The path that opened both to Obama and to Hiroshima was already open, the idea of the endless expansion of rights and the idea of an armed democracy, sometimes a lethal democracy. And we accept as one of the fundaments of our modernity the notion of evolution, natural selection, and Darwinian theory. So not only were they witnesses, midwives to an immense transformation in consciousness, they were midwives to the transformation in consciousness that forms the bedrock of our own continuing way of seeing the world. That's what interests me about these two men, how that happened. They were not solely responsible for it. They were not uniquely responsible for it. Thousands and thousands of men and women and forces helped make that change. But they were, as I said, the midwives of that transformation. We can't think of two human beings who played a more central role in that very profound change in the way we see and imagine the world. And the book then attempts to talk about how they did it, what the means were that they used, and the primary means that I think that they used, and the primary legacy that they left to us is their language. It's the things they said, the way they used words, and the way that those words changed lives and continue to change lives today. So the first chapter of the book, after the introduction, is called Lincoln's Mind. Because what came to fascinate me about Abraham Lincoln as I was reading about him and doing the research for this book, and one of the things that was a pleasure for me in writing this book is that I was, and I hope it remains in spirit on the page, always one day ahead of the reader. I was out doing my own reading in libraries and at home, and it was every day I would tell my wife what I'd read that day that was a revelation to me about these two men, and I hope some of the amateurish heat of that is still sensible on the page.